I'm Jed Hilley, the Executive Director of the Americana Music Association. Welcome to our, thank you. Welcome as we begin the celebration of our 25th anniversary as an advocate for the authentic voice of American roots music. It's a very exciting week. It's a very exciting time. It's my favorite time of the year, and I'm glad whoever that higher power is has given us an incredibly beautiful week in Nashville right now. So thank you all for making the trek to come here. I'm very proud to be able to call the next two people to the stage my friends. I'm humbled to say that I am acquainted with them. Their inspiration, their creativity, both of them, truly have inspired millions and inspired me. We have the great pleasure of truly having one of the godfathers of this community here, and I will now bring up Joe Henry to bring in T Bone Burnett for conversation. Oh, I fucked up. Oh, no, they did. I didn't do bad. No, come on. No, I thought you weren't going to come up after my introduction.
You can do this however you want to.
Thank you.
Well, good morning to you all. Thank you for joining us. It'd be awfully lonesome had you not. And thank you, Jed Hilley and the Americana world for acknowledging me, and of course, for acknowledging the man to my left, who has been a mentor to me and to many. So, what do you got to say for yourself?
Well, I'm glad you came. I was hoping y'all would come.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to start in a predictable place. I have a close friend named Krista Tippett who has a show called On Being. And she starts every podcast by asking people about their spiritual biography. I'm not going to ask you so much directly your spiritual biography, though I am asking that by asking, what is your first memory of music? And what's your earliest memory of music where you understood it wasn't just something you liked, but something that pertained to the person that you were becoming?
So I love that question. The first memory of music is The Naughty Lady of Shady Lane. I heard that when I was I remember I was maybe 3 or 4 years old. And then at the end of the song, do y'all know this song, The Naughty Lady of Shady Lane? Well, I forget who, do you know who wrote this song?
I don't.
But my parents had shelves full of 78s, and I used to listen to those. And this Naughty Lady of Shady Lane is you're worried that this is some kind of lady of ill repute, you know. Mm-hmm. And at the end of it, you find out she's like 5 years old or something. And it was an extraordinary reveal. Mm-hmm. And it taught me something about songwriting, and it taught me something about life. It tricked me. And then the next one was When You Begin the Begin. It's called a Cole Porter song. And I realized, and it was on a 78, and I realized that music could transport you to a whole other place. Begin the Begin is about a dance. When we begin the begin, the world is alive with tropical splendor. And I would put that on and I would be in Polynesia or something. But my first memory of music where I thought, oh, this is something I could do. This is something I want to do with my life, was I was at a friend's house and he had a little 45 player. Remember those little boxes about this big? Everybody who's over 105 like I am will remember this. And Jerry Lee Lewis was singing a whole lot of shaking going on. And I remember very clearly rolling around on the floor laughing at this explosion of energy and freedom and not caring in the least about the status quo. You know, it was obvious. he was going someplace. He was saying something that people in polite society didn't say. Yeah, I was about 7 or 8 when I heard this. And I thought, this is what I want to do I want to do this for the rest of my life. And then rock and roll lasted, when was that? That was maybe 1957, was that 57? And rock and roll lasted from about then, maybe a year or two before that, till about 1950. Hey, be quiet back there. Till about 1959. And by 1959, Buddy Holly had died in a plane crash. Jerry Lee Lewis was disgraced by the status quo. Well, also, I mean, he did do a very Louisiana thing, if you'll forgive me for saying so. Chuck Berry was in jail also for sort of a Louisiana thing. Elvis Presley was in the jail in the Army. Eddie Cochran had died in a plane crash. The whole, Little Richard was in the ministry. He had been guilted into being a minister. And the whole thing was dead, and what had replaced it was this sort of saccharine, whatever that was. Mitch Miller was the head of A&R for Columbia Records at the time, so it was all very smoothed out. All the rough edges were taken off everything, and whatever Jerry Lee Lewis was doing was or Little Richard was by that time Pat Boone going, wop, bop, a loo, bop. It was like ridiculous. Pat Boone was from Fort Worth. He was a milk salesman on television on a local station when I was a kid. And, and I mean, all that music was dirty. It all came out of hokum. Hokum was like early 20th century music that was just flat out dirty and funny. And so the rock and rollers were taking that hokum and turning it into something. They were subversive. They were making it so it would get played on the radio. So it wasn't quite as dirty as it was originally, which I guess hokum was played in vaudeville and honky tonks and whorehouses. At any rate, what happened then was the Beatles came along. And, one of the things we'll talk about in a minute, the Beatles are crucially important Americana artists. Even though they're from England, they gave us back our music. The Beatles played American music. I think of all of this as American music, starting with Buddy Bolden and Louis Armstrong and Bolden and going through the whole last century into now. And the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were extraordinary. And I hope one of these days, pretty soon, they'll be given Americana awards, because they deserve it, because they really when we had given up on this music that grew up out of the ground, they heard it and gave it back to us in the most beautiful way. And the Beatles opened up, they took the germ of that thing that came from Jerry Lee Lewis and Sister Rosetta Tharpe and many other people, and opened up. The first heavy metal song was Helter Skelter. The first country rock song was I Don't Want to Spoil the Party. Everything else that came after that, Graham Parsons, and everything that came after I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, owed a debt of gratitude to that song, to their understanding of the nexus, the intersection, to use that word, of country music and blues music and music from the Appalachian Mountains and music from the Mississippi Delta, and the way one of the things I want to say tonight, because I'm giving a few remarks at this event tonight, is I'm going to say, if you want to know what's good about the United States, listen to the music. Because in our music, people from all different cultures, all different religions, all different countries, different ethnicities with different experiences, different ambitions, different views of life have all come together in our music. And in our music, we've made harmony. We have realized the promise of the United States in our music. And that that's why I include all of this music in American music, Louis Armstrong and the Beatles. Oh, the pop songs, all the great pop ballads all go back to Hey Jude. Hey Jude, right? It was amazing when you look at what the Beatles did. They deserve a lifetime Americana award. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you all for coming. It's been really nice. You answered them all. I want to say that when you first recruited me, 1990 or whatever it was, after we had started working together, and brought me into this idea of myself being a record producer and learning under your arm, I know that at first I observed a real distinction between what I do as an artist for myself and what I do as a producer for other people. But when I look at your body of work, it seems very seamless what you have done as a songwriter and a performer and the range of your body of work as a producer. And I wonder, did it always seem to you a singular impulse? Was it always the same thing, just making something meaningful come out of a pair of speakers? Or did you have to cross that divide at some point?
No, I wanted to be Burt Bacharach when I was a kid. I thought that was the ideal life. And I sort of did it in a way. But for me, it was all about sound, creating music. It didn't matter if I was singing it or someone else was singing it. I always preferred for someone else to be singing it than myself, because then I didn't have to deal with my own narcissism and my own insecurity. I'm working with 5 people right now that are all over 80 years old. Willie Nelson, Bob Dylan, Twyla Tharp, Meredith Monk, and Ringo Starr. And they're all 5 of them are over 80, and all 5 of them are doing what I think is the most powerful work of their lives. And it's extraordinary. It's amazing working with them, because when you're working with 20 and 30-year-old kids, you're dealing with the fear of the future. You're dealing with in all of their insecurities and anxieties. When somebody's 80 or over 80, they have a great future behind them, and it's all second nature. And the sooner an artist can work from second nature, the more powerful, the sooner his work will become full and powerful and resonant. So, no, when I was 17, I bought a recording studio called Sound City in Fort Worth, where they had recorded "Hey Baby," and I started plugging things in and trying to do it. And one night, very early on, I smoked a joint. I've got that thing, synesthesia, that thing where you see colors when you hear notes. And I smoked a joint, and I was looking. I had this old Ampex board, and it had two VU meters lit up, and I started thinking those were my eyes, and then I started looking at the speakers, and all these notes started floating up to the speakers, and all these different colored notes were circling around the ceiling, and at that point my chair tilted back, and I floated up into these notes, and I was just looking at it all and listening to it all, and that's when I knew that's what I was going to do the rest of my life. At that moment, I knew that was it. So
I say that's a great story, and that's some fucking great grass.
But that's what it's all been for me. It's all been floating around in the ceiling with all these beautiful colored notes.
Well, let's talk a little bit about floating. By way of introducing that, I had an occasion years ago to record one evening with Ornette Coleman. And at one point, the song of mine we were working on, he told me, "Joe, this song has a lot of space dust on it, and we're going to need to move that." And he walked out of the room, and the young engineer who was standing there witnessing this just said, "Man, this this dude's like from outer space. And my friend Stephen Barber, the great composer from San Antonio, said, no, man, that's just Fort Worth. Everybody from Fort Worth is like that. And of course, I thought about the only other person that I know who's from Fort Worth and said, yeah, that tracks. But I bring that up because I've come to an awareness that I instinctively knew, but didn't know consciously until I think I was working with you in the early 90s, of just the true sacred and mystical power of music. And not any hyperbolic way, I'm not saying that. I mean, it is transformative when we get, when we get the business out of the way, and I'm not disparaging the music business, there's time for that. But I'm just talking about a dedicated engagement to music is to acknowledge its mystical power over us and how it works through us. I think that's something you've always known. I feel like you've always approached making records with that idea, not that you don't want to sell records, but what you were doing, to my witness, is shepherding things and protecting the mystical aspect of it so that that did not get deflated, even as it was going to go out into the world. And I wonder how you came into that awareness.
Well, so the first question you asked was about the spiritual, you said.
Yeah.
Well, music is my religion. Music is a religion. Life is, I feel, a religious question. And for me, music is the currency of that question. I don't think it's an answer to the question, but I think it's where you can swim in the question. And I would prefer to do that than have the answer because it's so much more interesting. The answer, I worry that the answer would be mundane. Mm-hmm. I worry, if somebody wants to know who God is and they think, well, God's a scientist who's performing this experiment. It's like, oh, that's a completely unsatisfying answer. Or any of the other answers we get, especially from evangelical fundamentalist Christianity these days, which is turning into a nationalist death cult, I think we both think of ourselves as Christians. I mean, maybe you don't.
Not in so many words.
But I think
but it's my form. That's how I was formed. I mean,
yeah, that's how
a Christian,
we grew
like
up.
I'm a Southerner,
Yeah, I'm a Southerner, and I grew up. In fact, the Christianity runs one of my ancestors was a guy named William Brewster, who was the religious leader of the Pilgrims on the Mayflower. There were two guys. William Bradford was the political leader, and William Brewster was a vicious old blister who was the religious leader. And my grandfather was secretary of the Southern Baptist Convention for 37 years. So, we've both grown up in that world. I also think of myself as a Buddhist, and I also think of myself as a mystic, and I also try not to think of myself at all. But what were we talking about?
We were talking about exactly that.
Oh, yeah.
I'm intrigued by that leads you to the point of thinking about yourself not at all. Because if you want to get into that level of mysticism, you just go back to St. John of the Cross, who lands somewhere between Robert Johnson and Lightnin' Hopkins on the great arc. But St. John of the Cross, of course, said, to attain all, you must desire to attain nothing. To be all, you must desire to be nothing. And that brings to mind the Tao. And it says, the true leader leads by inaction. And again, something I witnessed, not anything you ever told me, but when we were first working together, and I was your production acolyte, I just witnessed over and over again how much happened, not because you were ever telling anybody what to play, but you were creating an environment. You correct me if you think I'm off, but I watched you create an environment where everyone in the room, just by their nature, wanted to open a vein for you. And it wasn't about coaxing anybody into a certain role. it was about creating safe and loving space, and then people give you absolutely everything.
Well, yeah, people want to do that. What I always did was what I did was listen. I listened. You know, one of the things I've learned, there's a wonderful book I can recommend to everybody called The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist. And he posits in that book that human beings sang to each other like dolphins or whales for thousands of years before we innovated the technology of language. And the implications of that are clear, that when we sang to each other, it was pure tone, and everyone knew what everyone else was saying. So we had to invent language to be able to keep secrets, to be able to lie. So language is essentially for non-communication at its core. And I've lost the thread again. I feel like I'm high this morning.
I'm glad we're not out of phase.
But we were talking about the environment. So what I realized is through listening, like we're professional listeners. We're lifelong listeners. We've spent our whole lives learning how to be better listeners. You know, and I think you could tell we're both oriented, audio oriented. But through listening, if you listen to tone, if you don't listen to language, but you only listen to tone, then no one can lie to you. It's freedom. That listening to tone is the way through this dystopia that we're currently living in, where we have a technology that does not have a valence. The modern communication technology we have, it's impossible to distinguish between truth and lies. But if you listen to tone, if you listen carefully enough, you can hear the difference between an AI voice and a human voice. And that's the ability we all have to hone. That's the ability we all have to develop and hone.
Well, beyond the fact that language is a delivery system, it is important to remember that sound itself has meaning way before we manipulate it and use it just as a track to run thought across. That sound as we hear it is impactful. And to that point, I'm remembering when you did the music for the film Crazy Heart with your pal Jeff Bridges. I remember when you were out on the campaign trail for that film, you were on Fresh Air with Terry Gross. And I remember listening to that in real time, and I was sitting at home, and Terry at one point asked you, like, for our listeners who don't know, I mean, what does a record producer actually do? And I believed when I was listening that Terry thought you were being evasive. And I sat there at home with my mouth open thinking you'd just given away the entire store. because what you said and what I've witnessed to bear out in reality, when she said, what does a record producer do? You said, oh, Terry, you just listen really hard until it gets good.
Yeah, well,
and I think about how often, I have a friend who's a music writer who said, singers sing for you in a really unique way. What do you do to make them sing that way? And I say, the only thing, if I have a trick, it's just that I sit in the room where they can see me. And if they know that there's anybody just listening, then they give everything up.
That's what Sam...
They don't come out of the booth and find out that you've been out of the room on the phone or you're doing email or something. But if I sit where they know that they're not just broadcasting into the void, but reaching someone. I mean, Sinatra used to invite his friends into the studio, so he had somewhere to point that energy. But that idea that you gave Terry and announced to the world that, you, by the mere act of standing there as the first proxy that this music will ever have, just to listen. It's just like when the scientists talk about how things at a molecular level change merely because they're being observed. I think music happens because we're listening.
Yeah, Sam Phillips said that same thing. Sam Phillips, who was a great civil rights leader, he was a great record producer, a great cultural figure. He said that the most important thing you could do is the artist has to see you. Just what you just said, that he has to know you're there listening. And ordinarily, when I don't produce records much anymore because I feel like I've done that enough. And these days I'm writing all the time. I've got a new record I've put out this year, and I started writing songs again. And I love. That's the best part of life for me, is writing songs, writing music. But when I was producing records, I used to just go walk around the room where all the musicians were playing until I could hear everybody, what everyone was playing. So I'd be right there in the room with them, and they would play for me because I was there. And I do think I think both you and Sam are right that being able to be seen while you're doing it is crucially important, and to be seen not being looking at your phone, which that happens a lot these days.
Yeah. Well, in regard to your production life, we all can think of producers who have a dedicated sound. And I don't bring this up in any disparaging way. It's just another way in. I have some history with Daniel Lanois, and I was around him when he was working on a couple of projects, just peripherally, because my wife worked with him. And, Daniel is somebody who's cultivated a real sound, and I think any of his albums that you hear, no matter who the artist might be, his sonic sensibility is there kind of from the beginning. And I listen to records that you've produced over decades. Different artists, different musicians in the room. I don't hear you as having a sonic imprint. And yet when I hear the records that you've made, they all sound like you. And I wonder what you think that is that I'm hearing that makes me know it's you, even when I don't think that you have a particular haunted house that you run everybody through.
Yeah, I have no idea.
Excellent. Oh, I got more. I happen to think, in truth, in our culture right now, I think the concept of mentorship is becoming a lost and dying art. I've been really, really fortunate. I've had a couple of really significant mentors in my working life, kind of since the very beginning. Two who come immediately to mind because they're the rare birds who were forging a life as producers while also maintaining significant lives as performers and songwriters. That being my dear departed friend, the great Alan Toussaint, and that would be my present friend, T Bone Burnett. Beautifully enough, they have the same birthday, and I've given a lot of thought to that. But I know that you have brought a lot of people along as a true mentor. And I wonder if you had a primary mentor or two when you were really in the process of becoming. Let's see you wriggle out of that one.
I had a mentor who was a nuclear physicist, oddly, a guy named Johnny Stroud, who had graduated from Stanford at 17, magna cum laude. He wore like a cape around Stanford back, I guess, in the 20s or 30s, and he had been asked to work on the Manhattan Project, and he had declined for moral reasons. And he actually, as a response to the Manhattan Project, he wrote the program for the space station back in the 40s. It was his thought that nuclear weapons were going to destroy the Earth, and he had measured the amount of the half-life of plutonium or whatever it was, Excuse me, and and he determined that we were going to have to move off the planet and live on a space station. And he had said, you know, we only need 5% of the people in the world to run the current systems. He was at the time he was a systems analyst for the Rand Corporation at Point Mugu in California. He was an interesting cat, but he was incredibly smart. But he used to say things like, he would say, you know, you have to. He would say the parable of the lily pond. If there's a lily pad that doubles in size every year, and it takes it 99 years or 100 years to reach half the size of the pond, how many years does it take to cover the pond? And the answer is 1 year, you know. And he was a systems analyst, so he talked about our population, how frequently the population of Earth was doubling. And he viewed that as really our biggest challenge as humans, is what were we going to do when we got to this point where we are now. What are there, 6 billion people on Earth now or something like that? And we're doubling, what is it, every 40 years? So in the next 40 years, they're going to be 12 billion people on Earth. Then what are we going to do with all the plastic at that point, right? There are these major questions we have to answer, and we have to stop with all of this nonsense about immigration and all this crazy nonsense that's going on out in the political world, and start pulling together as human beings and dealing with some real problems we face.
Well, thank you for that. Well, it reminds me when we were talking a little bit over coffee about what's happening in the greater world right now. And I'm reminded of the great Buckminster Fuller, of whom I'm a great admirer. And
by the way, Johnny Stroud and Bucky Fuller were lifelong friends.
makes perfect sense. I was fortunate enough to see Buckminster Fuller speak when I was a freshman in college in Michigan. And I knew nothing about him. And I love those opportunities when we get exposed to something and we don't really know what we're about to encounter. So we're not, you know, anticipating anything. My older brother just dragged me into this lecture room where this small man stood there with thick glasses on and spoke without notes for 4 hours. It was extraordinary, and it was life-changing. And one of the things he said was, you know, for humanity to survive, it's essential that we all start telling the truth about everything at all times to each other. And I think that when we're talking about the state of the world right now, as you've alluded to numerous times, I've thought a lot about what my responsibility as an artist is, not only to my immediate community, but to the greater community. Because, you know, when Jesus talks about, you know, loving your neighbor, by the way, your neighbor is everybody who's alive at the same time you are. It's not about your zip code. It's not about your nationality. It's too late in the game for anybody to be thinking that nationalistically. It's suicidal. But I wonder how you hold, because you've become, you know, in some ways, as you've continued to work, you've become a bit of a public brain trust. You know, you've become a bit of a philosopher. I don't think that's putting too strong a word on it. It's become a part of what you do when you move around the world, not only making music, but talking on behalf of music and your life as an artist. And I wonder how you feel your responsibility as an artist in this moment, and what do you think is possible for the artist in this moment to do?
Well, I think that it's up to the artists. I think the politicians aren't going to solve this. They're way too compromised. The religious people aren't going to solve it. They're too compromised. The scientists aren't going to solve it because they're too confused. It's the artists. If anybody's going to solve this, if anybody's going to lead us toward a better future, it's going to be the artists. And so I feel that's the responsibility of every one of us who makes music, who makes art, to point toward a better day, to point toward a better future, to think what that means. We have to be, who's going to imagine a better future? The politicians aren't going to imagine a better future. The religious people aren't. They seem to be, so many of the people in that world seem to be completely absorbed with the past. You know, we have to look toward a better future.
Well, let me talk about your new album for a second in relation to that. When I first heard it, the prevailing thought for me after the first time through was how full of love and forgiveness it is, how much it's dedicated to concepts of inclusivity and compassion and forgiveness, and how free of judgment it is. And I think that is a departure from your earlier writing life, where I thought you sort of were operating, with a sort of a wry cynicism that was sort of like, like James Thurber playing checkers with Sam Beckett or something like that. And I don't say that in any way because that's the music you needed to be writing, and that's what the world was asking for at the time. But I wonder, did the songs lead you to this awareness, or did this awareness of where you are in your life right now lead you to this batch of songs?
No, I viewed the goal of art, throughout my life, I viewed the goal of art as to create conscience. And so when I was writing, I was always appealing to our consciences. And it's funny, I was reading an article about songwriting, and one of the things it said was that some shocking percentage of #1 hit songs had the word "you" in the title. And I thought about that, and I thought, when a songwriter uses the word "you," he may be speaking about himself, he may be speaking about another person specifically, he may be speaking about his dog, he may be speaking about the audience in general, but he's not speaking to each particular audience member. And each particular audience member knows that. Nevertheless, when we hear the word "you" in our unconscious, we think, well, I'm that way, or I'm not that way, or I don't want to be that way, or I know somebody who's like that. It puts you into that world of conscience, but it also puts you into the world of dreams. It puts you into a really unconscious place. And I realize when you're in people's unconscious, there's a responsibility to treat people with great respect and dignity and love and forgiveness, as you were saying, because we're all human and we all need forgiveness. And which led me into a whole other kind of writing, because I started writing to a different you.
Beautiful. I have no idea what time it is or what time it's supposed to be. I'm sorry?
It's supposed to be right now.
Yeah, it's supposed to be right now. I just want to make sure that we're not, wearing anybody out.
Have we worn you out? Okay.
Because I still want to touch on the fact that you have been involved in developing a new technology, a new disc form that is a delivery system for an analog experience. And I know that you unveiled this technology with some new recordings of old work with Bob Dylan. And I think there's more going on to what motivated both of you than just a Foxy delivery system for an analog experience. I feel like it has something to do with speaking to the way that our culture both values music and has been seduced into devaluing music. We go into these beautiful and expensive studios and we sing into the the best vintage microphones and bring our great instruments to bear. And every step along the way in contemporary record making, music gets degraded until it finally emerges into the world, you know, in the skimpiest form. And most people listen to it through plastic earbuds coming off a laptop speaker. And it can be really demoralizing as someone who traffics in the creation of music to watch the whole process become more and more degraded, so that, you know, when you finally, when I say you, I include myself as a listener, when we finally receive it, it is but the merest shadow of what it began to be. And so I wonder in what way you were driven by this technology, and does my characterization of your concern about the devaluation of music in our culture, does that hold water for you?
Yeah, that's right. And I want to start here. This is just a very simple point, but I want to get deeper into that. But you know, the head guy, the guy who started Spotify the other day, I read, he said, well, now that the cost of production is down to zero, it should be zero. Well, you know, the cost of production is zero if somebody gives you a recording device and a guitar, and you don't use any other musicians, and you do it in your bedroom or whatever. But if you use other musicians, you have to pay them. You know, a laborer is worthy of his wages, as the Bible says. And if you use, you know, if you want it to sound good, you need a really great microphone and a great instrument. The first thing you need is a great instrument. You know, music isn't about plugging one box into another box into another box and quantizing it and having AI, you know, give me a Lionel Richie song, but, you know, whatever. You know. So what I want to say is that every note you hit on a piano has every other note in the piano in it in some volume. So a pure sine wave is not that interesting, even though I realize a sine wave is analog. It's still not that, it's just a sine wave. What's most interesting about music is when you hit a note on the piano, that sine wave sets off other sine waves in the box, in this resonant chamber. I think of all instruments as drums, where they are resonating chambers that you attack with a stick or your hand, or with wind, with air that you blow through it, or with a bow. But they're all resonating chambers that you attack with something. So you have attack, and you have tone, and you have resonance. So what happens when you hit a note on a piano? You hear the sine wave, and then you hear an overtone, and then you hear other overtones, and an overtone structure takes place. And that's what we call resonance. And when you hit this note and this note, those two things both happen, and they begin to interact. Those resonances begin to interact, and you have more extraordinary resonances. And when you play a whole piece, the mathematics of a piece of, say, the Goldberg variations, the resonance of that, the math of that. I mean, Bach is probably the greatest intellect the human race has ever developed. And the resonance of that is impossible for a computer to comprehend. The computers cannot comprehend the complexity of music. They can't even comprehend visually the complexity of life, because they're just giving you this very limited version of it. So when you listen to a digital capture of a sound, you're hearing maybe 20% of the sound that's actually taking place in the room. So what Bob and I did was, there were two things. One, music's been devalued to zero because the cost of production is zero, according to somebody, and it sounds like hell. So people don't. So music doesn't. Recorded music, which is the most valuable thing we've produced in the United States. Our library of recorded music is by far our greatest gift to the world. We've spread our message of freedom and innovation all over the world with the soft power of American music. I'm digressing, but in 1926, when the record companies were bankrupting because radio had come online and people, because they could get music for free, didn't want to pay for it, buy music anymore. The record companies came down south and they started recording people like Robert Johnson, like Mississippi John Hurt, in places where there wasn't electricity, and it began being played back on places like WSM, as We Secure Millions, which was a radio station that was started to sell insurance to poor people. So, there was this whole new market, I guess you would call it, developed. But what the reality of it was that the poorest people's voices in the country were recorded, and their stories were broadcast and sent all around the world. And there's never been an act in human history like that's happened in the United States by the recording world. That's what we did. It's an extraordinary thing we've done, and we should remember that as we go forward. Also, as I was saying, it sounds like hell, so people don't respond to recorded music the way they used to. Music's become very background. Recorded music has. It's all become just a publicity event to get people to come to shows, basically, that's all fine. And there are musicians who are doing well with shows. Taylor Swift is certainly doing great. This is her second year where she's going to make over $1 billion. See, I view that as a wonderful thing. I love Taylor Swift and I respect her. But, while that's happening, the whole middle class of the world of music has been hollowed out. So what we've done is we've developed a new, better sounding, we've developed an archival analog storage medium we call it ionic, because it's an ionic deposition on an acetate. Which an acetate, now we're getting in the weeds now, is this okay? Okay. An acetate is the first disc that's made when all other discs are being made. And it's the best sounding transcription, better than tape, way better than vinyl. It's 3 to 5 steps, something like that, better sounding than vinyl. For the whole 60 years I've been doing this, musicians have said, if only my vinyl record sounded as good as the acetate. So knowing that acetates were the best sounding transcription, we asked what the problem with them was, and the problem is that they're soft. They're nitrocellulose painted on an flat aluminum disc so that you can inscribe a spiral into it. And that becomes the father of all of the other discs that are made, several generations down the road. But it's soft, so gravity pushing the needle into the groove creates friction, which creates heat, which melts the nitrocellulose, which is basically nail polish. And the friction also creates static electricity, which attracts dust, which causes pops and clicks. So this is of an acetate, you can only play it once, really, before it begins to degrade. So when you're making a vinyl record, you make acetates until you get one that's at the specifications that you like, that sounds the way you want it to sound. And then you throw that one away and make another one to those same specifications that's never played. And that becomes the father of all the other records. So we decided to see what we could do to to the acetate to protect it from heat. And we went to Georgia Tech, where they make parts of the space station that are exposed to the direct heat of the sun. And they coat these parts of the space station, and they last many, many times longer than they would otherwise. So we experimented for a number of years, really, with different formulas, different substances, and we were able to create a disc that you can, an acetate, that you can play thousands of times and it doesn't degrade at all. I played it for Jimmy Iovine the other day, and who's like an extraordinarily powerful producer, and he's a smart cat, and I love Jimmy. And it blew his mind. He said, "This is as quiet as a CD," and it is. And we played him a disc that had been played 1,000 times, over 1,000 times, and it had no noise. It had no, it had no pops and clicks, none of that. It was just dead quiet. But the music, because it's analog, the music sounds. Analog captures resonance exponentially better than digital does. So digital is a non-resident medium. It's also not an archival medium, because Steve Jobs told me himself before he died that digital technology is turning over every 10 years. And that was a few years ago. So it's speeding up now. But things you do, things you record in Pro Tools, things you recorded 10 years ago, you can't recall anymore. You can't get it. We had for a while, we had DATs. Remember DATs? So many DATs, you can't get any information off them anymore. Plugins aren't supported that you used 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 20 years ago. So we're recording on a non-archival medium, and we're distributing it on a non-archival medium, which is not what we want. That's not, because if this were the case, we wouldn't know about Blind Willie Johnson today, We wouldn't know about Elder J.E. Birch. We wouldn't know about all these crucially important musical figures of the last century that we've archived. So we've developed an archival medium. Bob and I went in and recorded 6 of his classic songs. A couple of years ago, we sold one disc of him, a new version of him doing Blowin' in the Wind. That's a heart-stopping version, and he's one of these 80-year-old people I'm talking about that's killing it. He's singing better than he ever has, and he recorded those 3 American songbook records, and he treated all those songs with extraordinary respect, because he has great respect for all those songwriters. And when we went in to record his classic songs, he treated them with the same respect. And he treated his own songs with the respect he treated Rodgers and Hart songs with, which he doesn't always do live. He sometimes will throw his songs away, or he reinvents them in the moment live. But this particular time he did it. So we auctioned one 10-inch ionic disc of Bob singing Blowing in the Wind 60 years after he wrote it, and it brought $1,800,000 for one disc. Do you know how hard it is to make $1,800,000 in the record business today? So at any rate, there are a number of reasons we did it, but the main reason is because we both love and respect the music of America, the music of the United States, and we want it taken care of. We want it archived, and we want it to last. In our view, that disc is the equivalent of an oil painting, and I don't think there is a more profound artist in the world today than Bob Dylan. The fact that he's a music artist doesn't make him any less of an artist than Rembrandt, for instance, or Cézanne. So that's what we're doing there.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for being with us. I'll just ask, just in closing, by way of, a benediction, if you have a single thought to offer, the youngest generation of artists, listeners as well, coming up, what do you share with them?
Well, right at this moment, what I would share is there's a wonderful drawing I have, or a painting or something. And it's a little fish that's this big, it's called art. And then there's a fish this big called entertainment, eating art. And then there's a fish this big called distraction, eating entertainment. And what I say is, the part that's important is the part down here, the little fish, the art. And if you make art, that's the stuff that will last forever. Entertainment won't last forever, and distraction certainly won't last forever. But art will. So don't neglect art, or don't abandon art for popularity in the distraction economy.
Well, thank you. I think you began this session by making a beautiful comment about, life is the question that we live. And it reminds me of Rilke, reminding us that we have to live the questions, and then maybe we will live ourselves into an answer. So thank you all. I invite you to go out and live your question.
Thank you for coming.